I'm very pleased to be here with the Purdue team, my colleagues, Robin Adams, Allison Godwin, Bill Oakes, Elizabeth Pearson, and Donna Riley. We regret that we don't have a student with us. It is the last week of our classes and our students are, I guess I would say, otherwise occupied this week. What we're going to talk briefly about today is a concept of leaning into change around the question of leveraging COVID-19 as a transformative disruption. This doesn't fall under any of the 5 broad themes for the sessions for this week, but we believe that it has bearing on all of those topics. The focus is squarely on the opportunity, we hope, we believe, we hypothesize, for educational change. The lens we're looking through is centered on whether COVID-19 can in fact be a driver for transformative change in education. I'm going to ground this, as we have been grounding ourselves fairly often in our discussions, in what I would characterize as major underlying and ongoing themes for engineering education over a long history at Purdue. And in some ways, I would say things that we feel pretty strongly are part of our identity. And so we're cognizant of these and thinking of these as part of asking these questions about transformative change. Some of the key elements, the land grant context in the United States focused on integrating education, research, and service. The innovation cycle that is built around research to practice and practice to research, connecting engineering and community, including redefining community as the world changes, striving for inclusivity and innovation and impact at scale, because we are at a large institution and in a large college of engineering. That said, a major disruption has occurred and it's impacting all elements of the system. Change has become an emergency. There's no option but to act. Decisions had to be made quickly, often without debate, often changing on the fly. And so we are asking, in this context, by choice or not, we are all adapting. Is it possible that COVID-driven changes could unlock some of the mindsets and deadlocks that in the past have been barriers to educational change? Is it possible that it could be opening doors to longer lasting educational change as we move forward? This is very much a work in progress. I'm not going to report on what we have accomplished, although we will talk about some of the things that we think we have observed and learned and potential opportunities that we see in the future. It touches everything: faculty, students, staff, institutions. My colleagues will talk briefly about 3 areas today: student experience, students and community and engagement, and mental health. And I'm pleased to turn this over to Allison Godwin.
Thank you, Leah. I'll briefly move us through this. So students are having a wide range of experiences due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and many of these are often not due to the traditional factors we focus on within the classroom or the curricular context of engineering education. So these are some data from an ongoing 2.5-year study, and we've been conducting longitudinal narrative interviews with 25 students across the United States. And that provided a really rich baseline to compare pre-pandemic to the current disruption and COVID-19. And some students, as expected, have really struggled with this transition. We've used the journey maps, one is pictured here, as an elicitation tool to have students reflect on their experience throughout the semester. And this student pictured here had her normal ups and downs at the beginning of the semester, but when classes were, in her words, canceled or moved online, she also faced a lack of stable home environment due to a tree hitting her apartment in a storm and needed to move out, but unable to go home because her family was also exposed to COVID. And she had to deal with all these issues while trying to finish a successful semester. Other students describe more positive experiences of moving to online, of setting their own schedule or taking up new hobbies because of the flexibility that an online environment offered. But I think the two quotes on the right here really illustrate a key theme that emerged from this data that we've been collecting as a part of a research study, that the reaction of faculty in creating student-centered experiences or not really dramatically shape the student learning environment and their experiences of stress or anxiety during the pandemic. So there's two example quotes provided here. The first really focuses on faculty who are people too, and they understand that this is a whole new approach. And the second really talked about faculty who didn't change their practices and even added on more work in the online environment. And even when students voiced the concerns and all the other things going on in their lives, that didn't make a difference and the students felt powerless. Leah, if you could go down. The next kind of slide really summarizes some of the things we've been thinking about is that students have to be active participants in education as decisions about learning dramatically affect them. This process made visible, necessary, and actionable things needed to address diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly around the ability to personalize our learning, all of those external responsibilities that students are facing with essential worker roles and family care in addition to their student roles, the issues of technology access that folks brought up previously, and the current racial reckoning that's going on in the United States, as many of you have probably seen on the global news, really having to address and look at the history of racism in the United States. And engagement at this point takes on new meaning and conversations that school and personal life aren't indistinguishable, and the computer is that nexus of work, home life, and other kinds of distractions, as well as the loss of interaction and really appreciating when that does occur and missing that, but realizing that desire and how to think about creating that in an online environment. Now I'll turn it over, I think, to Bill.
Okay, all this experience with Zoom, you'd think I know how to unmute, sorry. So with the online, some of the things we've been doing at Purdue have been online and hybrid. And we wanted to talk specifically about how we're dealing with engagement. We've talked about moving to student-centered, and engagement really balances the student-centered and also our community impact. One of the programs we have at Purdue that I get to work with, which Leah started, had about 600 students this semester, working on over 120 projects. And that was a combined, some in person and online. With our students in very different time zones, we actually had dedicated online sections that met very early in the morning or later in the afternoon. Some of them were hybrid. The way that we've balanced the instructional teams is we've had faculty and graduate students that could be in person, and also some of them were online. So in some situations we had online people in the classroom. The community interaction has been limited and different, that we've had to do a lot of virtual. There's been no international travel. We've got different protocols in the lab. And one of the things that happened is we took this time that there's actually been some new cross-cultural or cross-institutional partnerships out of this. Leah, could you go to the next slide? So if we look at kind of putting community engagement into the space, there's definitely been some challenges. With the pandemic, the underserved communities have hit harder. So there are actually more needs, yet we're separated from them and constrained with what we can do to actually produce solutions. But there have been opportunities. So the technology has allowed us to engage with different types of partners. Looking at, with our international work, remote implementation, which interestingly may be cost effective. We've had opportunities to connect globally with teams, with different universities. And I think we've gained new leadership insights into what we can do with the students. So I will turn that over to Donna, I believe. Or no, sorry, Elizabeth.
No problem, Bill. As an academic, so I work as an academic advisor with our School of Industrial Engineering. And so my role, or the role that academic advisors have at Purdue, is really to engage and interface with the student in a non-academic setting. So kind of non-academic educators in a way, talking about life and courses and all those things. Well, with COVID, it is a huge shift into the mental health and student well-being space. Just we've noticed that COVID has created this community. So kind of a positive thing, faculty, student, staff, this sort of mentality of we're all going through this thing together. And so we've seen a lot of positive experiences and engagements there. And by 2020 has been a year of managing uncertainty for students. So these are engineering students. They have a plan. They are pragmatic, they structure things, and they go into, and then COVID happens and everything just kind of goes away. And so what happens when the plan is canceled? I had a lot of conversations with students about that this year. And then we've seen, Allison touched on it, but universally just we're missing the human interaction. Online classes is efficient and it's working and it's what we need to do right now. But the comments students make is, I can't form study groups. I'm just not connecting with my peers in class. I'm learning content, but I'm not forming those networking opportunities as easily in an online format. Also increased importance in networks and mentoring for the entire academic community, staff and faculty also feeling that strain as well. And with that, we've seen an increase in isolation, depression, anxiety about the uncertainty or what the future may bring. And so just how do we adapt and respond to that as a university, as educators, and supporting our students? And so we've definitely seen this increase in emphasis on developing the whole student and serving the whole student as educators. So the academic, professional, and emotional side of things, I often have the conversation of, you are not three different people. You are one person. And so your emotions are going to have an effect on your ability to perform academically sometimes. And so it's learning how do you manage those things. But students say, I'm just not compartmentalizing. I'm like, well, you're one person. It's all integrated. So just having those conversations and bringing those up. And so some other ways that the university and the college has adapted this semester is creating some virtual events. So Zoom or Gather Town, which is kind of an avatar. You can walk around and meet people and integrate that way. I know our first year engineering school has been working with that this year to just try and help students connect. And then while the weather was nice, facilitating some outdoor events where people could be spaced out socially and safely.
All right, so I think it's to me, and I'm assuming people will holler if I'm not coming through okay. As Allison was sort of saying earlier in the talk, in the mental health and student well-being space, there really are just a huge set of challenges that have been revealed and exacerbated by COVID. So these are things that the university, in fact, had just launched a huge initiative around, and that our folks that are doing engineering education research at Purdue were fairly well positioned to collaborate with the provost's office to really think about, how are we addressing the whole student? How are we working on systemic racism? But I think that all of the recent events have really kind of, I guess, revealed in a new way exactly how important all of these pieces are. And I think it's a lot harder for engineering in particular to do the compartmentalizing that engineers like to do, right? We like to pretend that engineers don't have bodies, that everything that they're learning is in their minds, and we don't have to breathe in the classroom. Well, now a lot of engineering faculty are breathing with our students, right? Like there's a very real shift in how we are being even at a distance with our students. So these are some of the things that are sort of cracks in in the sort of almost immovable aspects of engineering that that folks at Purdue and elsewhere have been sort of pushing against and trying to move. So there is some hope in the middle of the space that we might be able to kind of shake the foundations a little bit. And I think we're seeing that a lot with the racial reckoning as well, that the students in particular, Black students at Purdue, have made it impossible to say no or to pretend that we are just going to set aside the problem of race for right now. So there is a pandemic, and there is a dual pandemic, because racism is also a pandemic in American life. And so to say, you know, that we're going to focus on one and not the other is not an option. And our students have made very clear to the administration that that's not going to be acceptable right now. So we're at a moment where we are really thinking about all of that. And so when you are layering, you know, mental health on top of the racism that's being experienced, on top of the loss and grief around COVID, and the fact that COVID is having unequal impacts by race in the United States, all of these things come together in a way that that I think engineers like to, what's the word, to reduce problems into simpler parts. And you cannot do that with the situation that we have right now. And so I think it's a good example of what Roger was talking about in terms of the complexity of problems. And Stephanie Adams talks about the social mess, right? So, you know, we talk about complex problems, wicked problems. Social messes are ones where people can't even agree with what the facts are. And so climate change is a good example of that. The pandemic is a good example of that. And I think we're in the middle of kind of that situation as well. So we can go to the next slide. That really, this is a moment where there's an opening where we might be able to use what's been revealed in this moment to lay the groundwork for something new and something that really does break into a holistic space that we maybe haven't quite gotten to, in particularly with engineering mindsets in some corners of our institution.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Really interesting, really interesting. I suppose it's hard not to come back with the question, where do you think these changes are? Obviously, I think some things, you know, you've mentioned there, you know, very clearly a direction. You know, the addressing racism is something that is only moving forward, we hope. But I think, you know, a lot of the discussions we're having are the things that you've seen in terms of student support, and the fact that the pandemic has certainly highlighted some of the disparity of resource that different students have. Are there any aspects of that or others that where you think actually we now know we've got to do more about this, and going forward there's going to be changes in the way we address this within the student cohort?
I mean, I would say definitely. And I think, you know, one of the issues has been Purdue was already making resources available around mental health. So that's both sort of informal, you know, making counseling services available, but also a lot of informal programming in student life, you know, working with students on overall stress management, stress reduction, all those kinds of things were already happening. But one of the things the pandemic has revealed is that the students that are really overwhelmed and struggling are not accessing those resources. Mm. And so there's a lot more that I think everybody that comes into contact with students, it's incumbent upon all of us to really be a community for students and to make the connections wherever we can make them. And I think this sort of emergency situation has made it, or multiple emergencies, if you layer these things together, has really made it incumbent upon all of us to do that work. And so in that sense, I think there's a bit of a community transformation that's happening at a lot of our institutions where we just have to be there in a way that we haven't been.
Mm. Yeah.
And I would say, so Elizabeth talked some about the whole student, and that you are not three individuals, you are one person, but that is not been, I think, central to a lot of thinking about engineering education, but it has become so obvious that the impacts that students are seeing and faculty and staff are seeing, but people in the academy as well as in the rest of the world are seeing, is that we can ask the question about what would an education look like if you thought about the whole student, and how would you lay out goals and objectives? What does curriculum mean? What do interactions mean? This has also really shown a light on how absolutely critical the interactions are to students, to professors. There had been, I think, a decade ago, a lot of conversations about whether or not the brick and mortar university was a thing of the past because we could all do online education. And I don't think that many people right now who would say, yeah, you're right, we can just do online education. And so there are things that we are learning, still have to be learned. You have people like Allison who are doing research, and the colleagues from Tsinghua who are doing research to ground this in really trying to understand the details. So I think when we were brainstorming, what did we want to talk about? Because there are a lot of things going on, but it's compelling because it really gets at the heart of what might be enablers of significant change in how we think about educating engineers.
Excellent. We've got one question in the chat, and then we'll move to our last speaker, and then we'll take the break a little bit later. But I want to get time for discussion and all the presentations in. So I guess this is probably addressed to Bill, I guess, by looking at it from Emmanuel, asking whether they could give a bit more detail on the team and leadership development. Are you referring to students developing their team working and leadership particularly?
Yeah, I think when I think the ownership, so a lot of the programs, a lot of the opportunities that students have in programs like EPIC, students have had a great deal of autonomy, but with the pandemic, it's taken it to another level. So getting students to figure out how we meet schedules. When we shifted in the spring semester to totally online, is turning it to the students and finding rhythms that worked. So like the data Allison showed, I think with faculty and classes kind of dictating, but in the project-based or some of the kinds of things that they're talking about, is turning it over to students and saying, we've got to figure out a way to make this work. It's been really refreshing to see how they've done that. Now, not turning it totally over, but where we play the mentoring and can go with that's what I was referring to. I think some of the kind of sacred things that we still held on to, even in the project space or studio space, has been turned upside down with that.
Yeah.
So one thing I would add as well, because Bill mentioned that some EPIC's teams are remote, some are in person, some advisors are remote, some are in person. I have been 100% remote since March. I've been advising 2 EPIC's teams since then. It was actually easier in the spring in a way. There was more dislocation, but the students had a half a semester of getting to know each other and establishing roles and working together. This semester, there's some of the students who know each other, some don't, but questions of leadership in the sense of how do you develop a sense of team? How do you build common purpose, shared moments, the things that go into making a team feel like a team when some of you are remote, some of you are in person? That changes over time because some are in quarantine, some are coming out of quarantine. And I think I've been acutely aware of it because I am working with these students 100% from a distance. And some of them I have never met, and I get to see them I don't think I would recognize them because the lab protocols require that they be wearing both masks and face shields when they're in the lab. But the teams are functioning, and the leaders, the student leaders, are stepping up in amazing ways to figure out how to build rapport virtually that engages both the remote students and so I think we're seeing a lot of creativity and realizing that there's a lot of room for creativity in how student leaders can develop, maybe with some mentoring, but a lot of it on their own in the circumstances, and that's something we ought to be able to take forward.
Yeah, I think we're seeing, it's Emmanuel comments in the chat, I think we're seeing much the same. I sort of get the impression that the students feel they should say they want to see us, but actually it's their peers that they're more worried about the interactions of in many cases.
Or in our case, the football games.
Yeah, we've done quite...
Well, it's been interesting because with the mix of online and in person, there's actually been more, I've had more students showing up in the one office hour that we do with face masks and face shields in the residence halls, that sometimes students just coming to visit and talk, which is a different phenomenon. So I agree that they want that peer-to-peer, but it's just been interesting that for me, it's the only semester I feel like I've been missed.
Yeah, well, and I think the engagement is really the piece that whether it's face-to-face or online, we're seeing this need. And Elizabeth was talking about that, where we did this for our first year program. We did this thing on Gather Town where the students were interacting online, and it was all, you know, it's a video game style interaction where they're hanging out together and they were playing games. Like they actually just set up games to play together. And they said, this is the first time that I felt like I could be a college student. Right. And so it's just giving them those opportunities, however we can do that, whether they're physically with us or not, is just hugely important. And it has been on like all hands on deck for people to do that. And I think at a place that's big like Purdue, I think we've relied on professionals in residence life, on sort of the student life side of the house to do that. And this is a moment where everybody has to be making that connection.
Yeah. Excellent. I think I think there's a lot of discussion in the chat. I'm not seeing questions. Oh, final question. Challenge parts is experiments. What are your plans for experimental for the rest of the semester, rest of the year?
Yeah, no, I think I understand the question. It's about hands-on. It's about hands-on and laboratory learning. And this is something we talk about a lot. There's a lot going on at Purdue, and there's a lot of different answers to that question. That's why I'm sort of gathering ideas. But there are virtual labs going on. And so there was this whole team that was doing research on virtual laboratories. And they suddenly had to level up in a very short period of time. And I think their work, they'd probably be the first to say, I don't think they imagine scaling it up as quickly as they've had to. So that's one set of solutions. There's been a very rapid development of virtual labs. There's definitely a recognition that even where you have good virtual labs, there's a need around lab safety and some specific protocols that once we get the students back face-to-face, we're going to need to be doing some supplemental learning with them before they really go on to their next level. So that's a current conversation that department heads are having about how can we collaborate across disciplines to give those sort of supplemental experiences for students who've had a virtual class but maybe don't have the full-on experimental thing. We have been doing a lot with one of the things we did with first year was to basically check out kits. So, you know, the sort of Arduino-like things that they can take with them and work anywhere, because we've had a lot of, our space was so brilliantly, efficiently used that there were 120 students in a space that we cannot fit more than 30 in safely now. And so we really couldn't be just rotating students through our hands-on space that we have. So instead we checked out stuff to them. They're doing it wherever they can, when they can. So they're getting some hands-on experience that way. So I think that's about, I've talked enough. We're doing a whole bunch of different things.
Yeah, we're doing much the same. I think we've spent nearly $500,000 on take-home kits. I mean, the electronic engineering ones, the Arduinos were okay. The chemistry department, getting that through the health and safety checks was a little more complicated, I must admit.
I can imagine.
But the really interesting stuff the chemistry folks have done. The first experiment involved cake baking, which went down incredibly well. Thank you so very much. I think these conversations are so interesting, so I'm not going to curtail them. We'll go through the Olin talk, and then we'll take a little break and just do some wrap up at the end and have a bit of time to meet with each other and discuss.